But night, the desert seemed to hold its breath. No wind blew, no dogs barked, not even the horses stomped their hooves against the ground. It was a strange, heavy silence that clung to the bones, as if the city itself had stopped breathing. That kind of silence isn't peace, it's a warning. And it was in that silence that I learned a truth I've never forgotten. Not every man who walks through a sheriff's door seeks justice. Some bring with them something that doesn't belong in this world. My name is Elias Blackthorn. I don't need to say much for you to understand. I wasn't just Sheriff of Red Hollow. I was the last. Not because the town ceased to exist, but because, after me, no one else had the courage to wear that star on their chest. And I don't blame those who refuse. The truth is that star never shone upon the living. It weighed heavily upon the dead. Red Hollow wasn't all dust, saloons, and gunslingers. It was a place where the law had to fight against things not written in any rule book. And I learned that early. I learned that bullets aren't for every enemy. I spent 20 years trying to protect this land, but with each case I solved, another arose that didn't fit into reports or courts. And that night, I understood that the worst enemy doesn't carry weapons. He carries silence. He waits. He approaches when you think you're safe. And that's how I met the man marked by the desert. He appeared unannounced, a wanderer who seemed to have been carved by the desert itself. Dirty, exhausted. But what truly struck me wasn't his appearance, but the invisible weight he carried. It wasn't an ordinary burden, but something that came from within him. Something that burned in his eyes like a scar the desert had carved into his soul. Red Hollow has always had its share of misfortune. I've seen men broken by loneliness, maddened by opium drunks who laughed at the gallows. But this stranger fit none of that. He had no revolver at his waist, no knife hidden in his coat. The gun he carried was in his blood, and it was only a matter of time before it would be fired, I realized. As soon as he crossed the threshold, there was something wrong with the shadow trailing behind him. It wasn't just longer than it should have been. It was more vivid than he was, and sometimes it seemed to move before his own body. This wasn't a drunken delirium, nor a trick of the lamplight. It was a sign, and signs in Red Hollow should never be ignored. It was there, that night, that I learned a bitter lesson. Not all outlaws are made of flesh and gunpowder. Some are shaped by the desert itself. And when the desert chooses a man, it doesn't let him escape. This man wasn't just marked by the sun or the dust. He was marked by something deeper, a curse that coursed through his veins and threatened to escape at any moment. And I, Elias Blackthorn, last Sheriff of Red Hollow, was foolish enough to listen to his story. He didn't rush in, nor stumble like someone fleeing. On the contrary, his steps were slow, dragging, as if each one were a sentence. The door creaked shut behind him, but it wasn't he who closed it. It was the wind. By warm wind that didn't belong on that cold, red, hollow night. The lamplight suddenly danced, and for the first time in a long time, I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. The air smelled of ancient dust, but also of wilted flowers, as if the desert had brought with it the scent of a forgotten cemetery. The man stopped in front of my desk. He didn't say a word. He just raised his right arm and pulled back the sleeve of his coat. I saw his skin. I saw the marks. They weren't ordinary wounds, not knife cuts or battle scars. They were dark lines, thin as dry roots, running down his arm to his shoulder. But what gave me chills wasn't the sight. It was the movement. The marks pulsed, as if they were breathing. He noticed my gaze and, for the first time, opened his mouth. I crossed Devil's throat. His voice was rough, heavy with sand. There, in the middle of nowhere, I found water, and I drank it. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Everyone in Red Hollow knew the stories of Devil's Throat. They said that anyone who drank from the water never returned the same. Some never returned. Others returned only physically. He continued. The water tasted like iron, but I was dying of thirst. And when I drank, I saw things. I saw eyes watching me from beneath the earth. I saw the moon covered in black veils. And since then, Sheriff, I haven't slept. His words were not delirious. There was firmness in every syllable, as if reciting an inevitable confession. He moved closer to my desk. The creaking floor seemed to groan under his weight, and that's when I realized it wasn't the floor complaining. It was the man himself. Every movement made his flesh creak like old wood. I looked out the window. The night was still, but his shadow was not. It moved on its own, billowing like a wind-soaked cloth, though the air was dead. The desert chose me, Sheriff, he said, his eyes burning with a dry fever. And now, what's inside me wants out. My fingers itched to touch the revolver's handle, but something told me that gunpowder and lead wouldn't be the answer. Because this man wasn't asking for help. He was delivering a warning. The wall clock behind me ticked. I can't explain how, but I had the feeling it wasn't just time moving forward. Something else had moved with it, and it was in that instant that I realized this wasn't just a man before me. He was the bearer of something the desert had missed. And if you think all this sounds heavy, wait until you hear what I saw when he lifted his shirt. Because the marks on his arm were nothing compared to what the desert had etched into his chest. He took a deep breath and slowly lifted his shirt. I expected to find more of those dark marks, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. From his chest to his abdomen, black lines snaked like dry rivers, twisted but not still. They moved beneath his skin, branching out like hungry roots seeking escape. Some pulsed in time with his heart. Others ran toward his neck, as if searching for the throat. My stomach lurched, and I swear for a second I thought I heard a sound not from him, but from the marks themselves. A muffled sound, like something was scratching the inside of his flesh. He dropped his shirt and stared at me. His eyes were tearless, but they held a plea stronger than any cry. Do you understand now, Sheriff? His voice was low, almost a whisper, but sharp. It's not a disease. It's not a fever. It's the curse of the desert. It's in my blood. And when the clock strikes midnight, I won't be me anymore. My hand was already on the revolver, but he raised his palm, shaking his head. No bullet will stop this, he said firmly. Only the rope. I remained silent, trying to understand if the man wanted to die or if he was seeking something worse. The lamp swayed once more, casting shadows across the walls. And then I noticed his shadow again. Now it was no longer glued to his body. He was standing erect, like a man apart, observing the scene with eyes that didn't exist. My whole body shivered. I drank from the forbidden water. He continued, and the desert has marked me, never to be free again. When the bell rings, it will leave me. It will use my skin as a door. I don't want to be the entrance to this, Sheriff. I'd rather be the lock, so do as I ask. Hang me from the rope before it's too late. Those words hung heavy in the air like lead, an impossible request. How could one hang a man who didn't seem criminal, but condemned? How could one choose between killing an innocent man or allowing something even more terrible to come to light? I looked at the old wall clock. The hand moved slowly, but each second seemed heavier than the last. It marked 23 hours and 47 minutes. 13 minutes. 13 minutes that separated me from the truth. My instincts screamed to put him in the cell, call the pastor, pray for his soul. But another part of me knew no prayer would break this. It wasn't a church thing or a doctor's thing. It was the desert itself speaking through him. He fell to his knees on the office floor. The wood groaned as if it felt the pain along with him. Don't mistake me for a criminal, Sheriff. What consumes me isn't guilt. It's condemnation. If these scars take hold, there won't be anyone left in Red Hollow. For a moment, silence returned, and then the wind blew in through the windows, bringing with it a smell that shouldn't be there, the smell of wet earth. But there was no rain, he said, spitting out the grains. He doesn't forget, he plants. And when midnight comes, I won't be a man anymore. I'll be his garden. And if you think his request was already impossible, wait until you hear what happened when the first sound escaped his body. Because from that moment on, I knew that midnight wouldn't just be the end for him. I drank from the hidden spring in Devil's Throat, he said, his voice breaking. And ever since, those seeds have been germinating within me. He ripped his shirt open with his bare hands. I saw cracks opening in his chest, and from them came not blood, but sand. Dark sand, mixed with shiny grains like shards of glass. The sand fell to the ground, but it didn't stay still. It moved. Each grain crawled like a tiny insect, trying to attach itself to the next. The man fell to his knees, gasping for breath. With each cough, he coughed up more. The lamp flickered, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I looked around and noticed the spilled sand moving toward the corners of the office, as if searching for invisible roots to burrow into. He lifted his head, his eyes burning with a dry yellow glow, and whispered, "I carry the desert. 10 minutes remained. 10 minutes until the seed finally sprouted." And it was at that moment that I heard the most horrible sound of my life. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the creaking of wood. It was the sound of roots growing, tearing at his flesh from the inside, searching for a way out. The man fell to his knees on the floor, gasping like a condemned man, his every breath seeming to bring out more sand. It wasn't dry, dead dust it was living, pulsating sand, churning as if breathing on its own. It dripped from his mouth, from under his fingernails, even from the corners of his eyes, forming small mounds on the floor that soon dissolved into rows of moving grains. The sound was unbearable, a constant rustling, like roots growing underground, tearing through wood and flesh at the same time. The entire office seemed to echo the noise, as if the walls were crawling with invisible insects. The man clutched his chest, trying to contain the cracks opening beneath his skin, but there was no strength to hold it in. I watched his skin move like a dry field being tossed by the wind. Sheriff. His voice came out scratchy, like rocks rattling against each other. It's being born. At that moment, the wooden floor creaked loudly, as if about to give way. The spilled sand no longer stayed in place. It crept toward the walls and, upon touching the corners, rose as if climbing inside the structure. I saw cracks forming, and from them sprouted dry spines, thin as bones, moving like antennae searching for air. I instinctively drew my revolver, but soon realized the absurdity. There was no target. Shooting would be like shooting into a storm. The man arched his body backward and let out a scream that wasn't just his. It was a chorus. With each passing second, more voices joined the sound, as if each grain of sand had its own mouth and was screaming at the same time. The sound pierced my chest, vibrating inside my skull, and for a moment I lost track of where I was. When I came to, I noticed something even more terrifying. His shadow was no longer on the ground. It was spread across. "Hang me now," he screamed, choking, spitting sand. Because what came next was the closest thing to the end of the world Red Hollow has ever seen. The office felt less and less like mine. The place where I'd spent 20 years serving the law now breathed like a living organism. The walls swelled and shrank silently, like invisible lungs. The floor creaked beneath my feet, not from the weight of the wood, but because something was crawling beneath it. Every crack released a warm, damp, dust-laden. My hand trembled. I, Elias Blackthorn, last sheriff of Red Hollow, had never feared pulling the trigger when faced with an outlaw. But I had never faced such an enemy. This wasn't about justice or crime. This was about deciding who would live to see the sun. The sound of the needle was no longer that of metal against. I took a step toward the rope, another, and each time I advanced, I felt invisible hands trying to grab me by the ankles. I looked down. From his shadow, arms were beginning to rise, multiple, thin as roots, but with human fingers trying to hold me. "If you don't do this now," he shouted, his tone half human, half storm, "the desert will rise in Red Hollow, and you will watch the world end from this window." I swallowed hard. My mind raced between two choices: kill a man who begged for his own death, or risk seeing what the desert had planted within him blossom. The knot slipped through my fingers as if it had a life of its own. And in that instant, I realized there was no more time to think. There was only choice, and it was as I lifted the rope, ready to make my decision, that something unexpected happened. The clock struck midnight. It wasn't an ordinary sound. It wasn't the metallic dong I heard every day. The man lifted his face, and his skin no longer felt like skin, cracked like wet leather, ready to tear. From those cracks, more sand oozed, but now it was hot, glowing orange, as if it carried fire within. My hand gripped the rope. The knot seemed to pulse like a living heart, throbbing by against my skin. It was as if the gallows itself were begging me to fulfill its destiny. The man's shadow, previously only a distorted reflection, rose from the ground. He grew, stretching until he reached the ceiling. He had thin, bony arms, and in place of a head, a dark crevice from which wind blew. When he opened his invisible mouth, no human sound came out, but a chorus of "I'm not me anymore." It was then that I realized there was no turning back. Pulled the rope, tied it to the thickest wooden beam on the ceiling, and quickly tied a noose. The knot seemed to fit on its own, as if it had waited a lifetime to be around his neck. I placed the noose around the man, and for a moment I felt the cold of the rope touch my skin too. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was the smile of someone who knew more than he was letting on. "You think you'll kill me," he said, in a voice that was no longer his, "but you'll only keep me until the next moon." I gritted my teeth, held tight, and pulled. The rope tightened. His body rose, and the entire office seemed to shudder. The shadow that had risen writhed, screaming mouthlessly, until it shattered into pieces of dust that swirled through the air and disappeared. The man stopped struggling. The sand falling from his mouth stopped. For a few seconds, silence filled the room. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of the desert. The clock struck 12, and then a 13th. The hand turned on its own, as if laughing at me. I looked at the suspended body. His eyes were open. There was no longer despair in them, only a deep emptiness where the wind seemed to swirl endlessly. And in that instant I realized I hadn't killed the man. I had only delayed the inevitable. The ground beneath my feet shook from the crack between the boards. A blast of sand rose, hitting my face. I heard a whisper that came from no mouth, only from the dust. "The seed has already been planted." My bones froze, and for a moment I felt like I had a noose around my own neck. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and understood. The desert can't be killed. The desert spreads, and if you think the story ended that night, you're wrong. Because since then, every time the wind changes direction in Red Hollow, I feel the noose tighten around my neck again. The next video is already on your screen. Click now, before the darkness finds you first.